Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to uncover one of the main secrets of European wealth. When we talk about the greatness of Europe, many people think of the Industrial Revolution, technology, and finance. But what if the key to their success lay far beyond the continent? The answer is the East India Companies, private trading corporations that controlled entire countries, completely changed the world economy, and turned trade into a weapon. But let's start with some tea. If we ask you to name the three most popular drinks, tea would definitely be among them. It came to Europe only 400 years ago, when Portuguese merchants brought mysterious leaves with a tart flavor from China. In England, tea became trendy in the middle of the 17th century, thanks to the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza, wife of King Charles II. However, only the rich could afford it for a long time, as the price of tea was too high due to monopolies. At that time, China was the only supplier of tea, and the British East India Company handled shipping to Europe, holding a monopoly on the trade. But Britain wasn't happy with its dependence on China. Prices were too high, negotiations were complicated, and restrictions were imposed. Then the British decided to establish their own production in India, brought their tea bushes, and developed large-scale plantations. Over time, India became the largest producer of tea, surpassing even China and Kenya. Ironically, 200 years ago, Indians hardly ever drank tea, and today the country consumes 80% of its own production. This is just one of the many imprints left by the East India Companies. These corporations started as trading enterprises and ended up as major corporations with their own armies. They made Europe rich, but failed to survive the Industrial Revolution. This is the story of how the lust for profit changed borders, economies, and the destinies of entire nations. Take a look at one of the major trade routes of the Middle Ages, the Great Silk Road, which is 12,800 kilometers long. 1,000 years ago, caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals traveled from China through Asia to the Middle East and the Eastern Roman Empire. The final destination was Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, the most important trading hub linking Europe and Asia. Here, Venetian and Genoese merchants bought goods from the East and resold them in Europe. But in 1453, everything changed. The Ottoman Empire seized Constantinople, and with the fall of the Byzantine Empire, they gained control of key points on the Silk Road, including the Bosphorus Strait. Trade routes were disrupted, and the high taxes and duties imposed by the Ottomans made trade through this route economically unfavorable for Europeans. Thus began an era of searching for new sea routes to bypass the Ottoman Empire and directly receive goods from Asia. These searches were the beginning of the age of great geographical discoveries, which changed the world history forever. The Portuguese were among the first to venture into distant waters in search of new routes. Being on the outskirts of Europe's main trade routes, they were forced to pay sky-high prices for spices and fabrics, buying them from more fortunate neighbors. This motivation was strong enough to bring the Portuguese success just 45 years after the fall of Constantinople. The navigator, Vasco da Gama, sailed around Africa from the south and reached the coast of Hindustan, a peninsula in South Asia where India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan are located today. This was the first European sea route to Asia. Simultaneously with Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus was also searching for his way to Asia. But his intentions were different. He was looking for a western route. When he sailed to the Bahamas, he mistook it for part of East India and called it West India. Of course, the monopoly trade with Asia made Lisbon the capital of Portugal, the largest trading hub in Europe, where goods from Hindustan were distributed across the continent. The information about the sea route from Europe to the shores of Hindustan soon became well known, and merchants from Spain and the Netherlands became actively involved in the trade, earning hundreds of percent of the profits. England remained aside from this prosperity. In the 16th century, it had no powerful navy, and its share of foreign trade was small. Cotton and spices for London were mainly supplied by the Spanish and Dutch, setting monopolistically high prices. To change the situation, Queen Elizabeth I of England signed a charter in 1600 for a new company to establish trade with East India. Basically, with this document, the Queen created a real cartel, and she planned to make good money from it. The company was given a monopoly on trade with South Asia and was exempt from most British duties and taxes. However, such privileges were not given for no reason. The British government was turning this cartel not only into a trading force, but also a military force. The company was allowed to create its own army and navy, mint its own coins, and even conduct diplomatic relations with local rulers. Thus, the company gained actual independence, becoming almost a state within a state. Hindustan was an unexplored but promising region, and the British were ready to invest all their efforts to capitalize on it. Realizing the competition would not wait long, 2 years later, the Dutch created similar cartels. And later, other European countries such as Denmark, Portugal, France, Austria, and even Sweden followed the example. Thus began the era of the East India Companies, the first corporations in history to change the economy and politics of Europe. The idea of the East India Companies was to send expeditions to the East on a regular basis, bring rare goods to Europe, and sell them at a sky-high price. The profitability of such expeditions in the 17th century was about 400%. However, it was not easy to implement it. First, sending one ship cost about 100,000 guilders. For comparison, the famous painter Rembrandt in the early 17th century bought a multi-story house in the center of Amsterdam for only 13,000 guilders. Secondly, every fifth ship didn't return home. Ships were caught in storms, attacked by competitors and pirates, and the expeditions could last up to 10 years due to organizational problems. A trade trip to Hindustan was like a startup with high risks and incredible profitability. No one wanted to take such risks alone, so the assets of the East India Companies were distributed among a group of investors. The capital of the British company was initially invested by 125 investors, including rich merchants, aristocrats, and members of the royal family. The Dutch company went further and offered to invest to an unlimited number of people by holding the first in history public offering of shares in 1602. More than 1,000 shareholders invested in the company, and on average, over the 200 years of the Dutch cartel's existence, its shares brought investors about 18% per annum, a return that is considered hardly achievable today. In the early years after the establishment of the national cartels, England and the Netherlands actively conducted an exploratory policy in Asia, establishing trade ties with the local population. However, the Dutch company was the obvious leader in the region. Of course, there were conflicts between competitors. For example, in 1623, there was a massacre at Ambon, an Indonesian island where the Dutch Factoria, a kind of trading settlement, was located. The Dutch suspected that the English were conspiring with the local authorities to topple the leadership of the Factoria and establish the rule of the British company on the island. After investigation and torture, 10 Englishmen were executed, which of course exacerbated the tension between the countries. To counter Dutch dominance, in October 1651, the English Parliament decided that all goods should enter England only on English ships. This decision supported the development of the National Navy and prevented the Dutch from capitalizing on the British market. Of course, trade with the British was not the main source of income for the Netherlands. However, the new law actually allowed British pirates to seize Dutch ships in national waters. The largest empire of the time could not tolerate this situation. Soon, the First English-Dutch War broke out, but it did not solve the problem. It only aggravated the conflict. The following wars were a variable success and weakened the Dutch considerably. The Dutch economy depended heavily on the success of the East India Company, which, due to its enormous scale, had become extremely bureaucratized and inefficient. Communication between headquarters in Amsterdam and local managers in Asia was difficult, and local employees often only cared about how to steal more. Furthermore, with the growth of British trade, the Dutch company lost its monopoly on the supply of spices to Europe. Competition from the British, inefficient management, and constant hostilities led to serious problems for the company. First, the cartel began borrowing from the government, and in 1798, the Dutch East India Company was declared bankrupt and was nationalized. The same fate befell the French Company. Defeats in the colonial wars of the 18th century revealed the country's institutional backwardness and became one of the reasons for the Great French Revolution. In 1793, the leaders of the French East India Company were accused of counter-revolutionary activities and arrested. The company was liquidated, and its assets were nationalized. Since the end of the 18th century, after the elimination of competitors, the British company was able to freely develop colonial India and maximize profits. When the rivals were eliminated, the British company's business was booming. Its bonds were generating excellent yields, and the company itself was generating up to 10% of the tax revenues of the British Treasury. To understand where such financial results came from, we should look at how people in Hindustan lived. One of the reasons for the enormous profits of the British was the fragmentation of the local rulers, the Nawabs. Constant conflicts between them weakened their power, and many turned for help to the British, who were willing to support the local rulers in their political ambitions for a reasonable fee and trading privileges. In the 17th century, the cartel had to spend a lot of money on military expenses. But by the end of the 18th century, the maintenance of the East India Company's army was mainly covered by the local population. In fact, the military expenses of the metropolis were covered by the colonial treasury. Of course, some Nawabs resisted expansion, but in some cases, local merchants intervened. They bribed the Nawab troops because trade with the British company was too lucrative, and they didn't want to lose such a partner. This was the situation in Bengal, a large region of South Asia. In 1757, when the Bengal Nawab tried to prevent the British from consolidating the Victorias in Calcutta. Eventually, the Victorias were consolidated and a new ruler was entrusted to the throne. This consistent trade and military policy, operating over several decades, made the British company a monopoly in the region by the early 19th century. Hundreds of thousands of local artisans were forced to sell their products to British Victorias at minimal prices, and the forced enclosed trade had disastrous consequences for the local economy. For example, at first, the company actively exported Indian textiles, which were popular in Europe. But with the development of the domestic industry, Britain not only imposed high duties on imported textiles to protect its manufacturers, but also completely prohibited the export of Indian textiles so as not to deprive the metropolis of markets. This led to mass poverty, and in 1834, the British Governor-General wrote to London, "The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." Other industries were also affected. To free up land to grow opium poppies, which the company was illegally selling to China, rice and grain crops were eliminated in India. People began to starve, and one of the largest famine epidemics in Bengal in the 1770s killed 10 million people. This situation couldn't last long, and in the 19th century, people's uprisings began to break out regularly on the lands of the British company, which seriously alarmed the government of the metropolis. Of course, it was not only the people's riots that drew the attention of the British authorities to the company's activities. Britain was much more concerned that by 1830, the British East India Company ruled a region with a population of 100 million people. Bengal alone had 4 times as many people as England and Wales. Wealthy employees of the company began returning to their homelands and buying seats in the British Parliament. By 1790, their number had reached 45 of the 558 members of Parliament, which greatly annoyed the aristocracy. Many British industrialists also complained to Parliament that Indian goods were drowning out domestic production. Not surprisingly, from the late 18th century, the authorities began to weaken the cartel with high duties and restrictions on its monopoly rights. As a result, a profitable company turned into a borrower, who started to borrow from the government. But who wants an unprofitable company? From the middle of the 19th century, the East India Company no longer fit into Britain's economic strategy. The uprising of the mercenary Indian soldiers, the Sipayas, in 1857 was the last straw. In 1858, the British Parliament began bankruptcy proceedings that lasted for 16 years. In 1876, India came under direct British rule, although the country still had almost a century before independence. The East India Companies played a major role in India's history. But how did their activities affect the country? The East India Companies dominated Hindustan for over 200 years, and during that time, they built railroads and telegraph lines. The Europeans provided education, which contributed to the formation of a new class of Indian elite that played a crucial role in the independence movement. They also introduced the principle of the impersonal abstract firm into world trade and accumulated the experience of corporate governance that formed the basis of modern management. But what was the cost at which this experience was achieved? The destructive policies of the cartels led to the degradation of handicrafts and agriculture. Many people died of starvation and in the military conflicts caused by the East India expansion. Undoubtedly, the long-lasting colonial policies are one of the main reasons why India is still one of the poorest countries in Asia. The history of colonialism has left a deep scar, and it is important to remember its consequences in order to build a future without repeating the mistakes of the past. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share your thoughts on the impact of the East India Companies on India in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in future episodes.